Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to chair this session because I'm sure it will be amazing. Our speaker this afternoon needs no presentation, I think, Professor Shai Lavi, but I'll present him, all the same. He's the director of the Edmond J. Safra Center for Ethics and the co-director of the Minerva Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of the End of Life, both at Tel Aviv University. He's currently working on the history of Jews and Muslims in Germany, focusing on the debate on animal slaughter rituals. The paper that he will present today is titled Loss and Preservation in Posthumous Sperm Retrieval. Let me present our commentator as well. Professor Haim Hazan is a professor of sociology and social anthropology and associated with the Herzog Institute on Aging. He's also a co-director of the Minerva Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of the End of Life and a senior fellow here at the Edmond J. Safra Center. His main areas of interest and research cover the life course, time, culture, and interactional aspects of old age. He currently focuses on integrational relations and life stories. Shai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yofi. So as Yofi mentioned in her presentation of my work, I am interested in the morbid and different forms of the morbid. So it won't be surprising to you to hear that I had to skip the last part of Frederick's paper because I went to a funeral. This paper actually brings together the end of life and the beginning of life. I won't even try to convince you that I had to spend the morning in an IVF clinic. Don't believe me. It's too strange. Okay, so basically,
you can be born again.
Yes. So basically, my paper is on postmortem sperm retrieval. That is the extraction of sperm from a dead body for the purpose of future reproduction. Though technologically today we can also speak of ovo extraction. Culturally, this has not yet been practiced, also technologically more complicated. Most commonly, postmortem sperm retrieval is a response to a sudden death of a young and childless man. This is not only an Israeli phenomena and not only among soldiers, but there is clearly, as the paper suggests, an Israeli-Jewish angle to some of these questions. At first, this may seem merely as another step in the development of reproductive technologies, but it is a kind of step that allows us to question some of these technologies. It has a certain distinctness. I think that what is most striking is not so much, or not only the reproductive side, but the side of life, but the fact or the way in which life and death intersect and are transformed in this practice. Never has the dead body been so potent, or so it seems. In terms of political theology, or perhaps rather biopolitical theology, this is a combination of Immaculate Conception and the resurrection of the dead. If you want the Jewish analogy, much less metaphysical, that would be the Levirate marriage, to which I will later return. My question for the paper is quite simple. On whose behalf and in whose name is postmortem sperm retrieval performed? The common answer offered by the law, that is the regulators, the courts, and legal scholars, most legal scholars, is that postmortem sperm retrieval manifests the will of the deceased, the presumed or supposed will of the deceased. Had he been alive, this is what he would have wanted. This is, in principle, an expansion of reproductive autonomy. This reading, which is suspect, I think, from the beginning, has become ever more questionable given recent developments, again, especially in Israeli law. So what we see is a gradual development of this practice of postmortem sperm retrieval. It begins when there is internationally, and this is again not specifically Israel, it begins when there's an explicit wish of the deceased. This usually happens when the deceased was ill and could actually foresee the death, and was usually married or in a relationship and wanted to offer this possibility for the spouse. It develops then when there's no explicit wish and there's only a presumed will of the deceased, still within the liberal framework of reproductive autonomy. But then the Israeli law kind of takes off on that. And then even if there is no expressed or hardly any presumed will, and even if there's no spouse, and that's the important point, still this can be carried out. The grandparents will be leading this process, and they will be granted the right to actually use the sperm. And in the most recent decision from a month and a half ago, the Israeli courts have taken yet another step forward in this and have allowed the use of the sperm from the deceased against the objection of the spouse. So the spouse says, this is not what he wanted, this is not what I want, but that's perhaps less relevant. This is not what he wanted, but the grandparents want a grandchild, and the courts have allowed that. So the paper is a search for language that can capture the phenomena of postmortem sperm retrieval. And although I don't say this explicitly in the paper, in fact, it tries to pursue this question in a kind of sequence of possibilities in search of different languages for understanding this practice. And it begins with the law, and as already said, challenges this idea, and then it moves from the language of the law to the language of psychology, and from the language of psychology to that of anthropology, and then it ends up in something that doesn't really have a name, but we can call it onto-theology, an attempt to think about the historical ontology of this idea of sperm, postmortem sperm retrieval. So those of you who have read the paper will be familiar with the story that I'll recount now, but I think it stands at the heart of the paper and will allow those who haven't had the chance to read the paper in full to grasp what this could be about. So this is the story of Rachel Cohen's son, Kivan, who was hit by a bullet from a Palestinian sniper in 2002. While the casualty notification unit was still in the family's living room, Rachel went into her son's room, took a large frame photo, and smashed it on the floor, crying out, "Kivan, where have you disappeared? Where is your pretty face, these eyes? Everything will be buried, nothing will remain. Where is the little Kivan you promised me?" 10 years later, she recalls how the idea of postmortem sperm retrieval occurred to her at that very moment. And suddenly it was as if I heard him. "Mom," he said to me, "it's not too late. There is still something you can take from me. What about the sperm? Don't you want it?" The army was helpful, and the sperm was harvested from the body within the 36-hour time window. But in the absence of a spouse or a long-term relationship, the state was reluctant to allow its use. The family was in the possession of 16 syringes that could allow nearly an infinite number of children to be reproduced, but they could use none. The parents, accompanied by a lawyer, turned to the Attorney General, requested his approval. After a prolonged period of negotiations, the parent discovered, to their dismay, that during the time they were waiting for his reply, the Attorney General had prepared binding guidelines that allowed only partners of the deceased and not parents to use the sperm. The family argued that the directive should not be applied retrospectively, and after 2 years of legal struggle, the request was finally granted. But the story did not end there. There was still the problem of finding a suitable mother. Rachel began dating women to find the right match. The woman would not be offered money and would need to accept the grandparents as part of the extended family, and most importantly, take upon herself the raising of a dead soldier's son and his mother's expectations. More than 10 years after the son died, Rachel was still searching for the right woman. In the course of the years, 3 women, Each in her turn tried to conceive, but after a load of hormones and numerous trials failed. Rachel was still searching. When asked how much longer she will pursue this mission, she responded, "A friend of mine had a dream. He, my son, came to her and asked, 'Tell my mother she should not give up and should continue.' So my friend asked him, 'Why won't you tell her that yourself?' And he replied, 'My mother is in a difficult psychological state and I cannot go to her.' 'You go,' he says to the neighbor. This was 5 years ago," she continues. "He too wants his child, and I hope I will carry out the task. Sometimes I wonder to myself whether this task is not too big, and I ask Kivan, why isn't it working? How much strength do I have? I can't, but I don't have an alternative. I will keep going until the last drop of sperm." Time has not been a cure to Mrs. Cohen. The specter of the dead continued to haunt her. She seems fixated on the idea and cannot give up. She feels that giving up would be a betrayal of her son. Rachel has placed a shrine in the memory of her son at the entrance of the apartment and tests the women she brings home for their reaction. How moved are they by the photos of the dead soldier? How authentic is their reaction? She was unable to move on in life, and by her own account could not find joy in her other children and grandchildren. In 2013, 11 years after Kivan's death, his mother's endeavor materialized. Rachel found a mother for her grandchild, and a baby girl was born named Osher, Hebrew for felicity. Okay, so this is a story, and the question is, what can we make of it? I mean, there are similar stories to this. And the story seems to lend itself perhaps too readily to a Freudian framework. Freud famously draws a distinction between mourning and melancholia. While mourning, he explains, is the common reaction to the loss of a loved person. In some people, the same loss produces the pathological disposition of melancholia. Freud emphasizes that mourning too involves grave departure from the normal attitude of life, but is not regarded as a pathological condition. We believe time is the best cure, and that any interference with it is useless or even harmful. Freud captures succinctly the distinction between the normal and the pathological response to loss when he writes, the melancholic displays something else beside which is lacking in mourning, an extraordinary diminution in his self-regard, an impoverishment of his ego on a grand scale. In mourning, it is the world which has become poor and empty. In melancholia, it is the ego itself. And so this is the psychological account of this loss and preservation. I think that this account is in some ways limited, and it is limited because it still focuses on the individual, on the question of the individual in his strife. Now it's no longer the presumed will of the deceased, but that of the parent. So after, and I think that it's, and I didn't put this in the paper, but I think it's especially telling that, speaking of Freud and the psychology of dreams, that it's not her dream, right? It's not, she's the one mourning or in melancholy or whatever, but it's not her dream, it's her neighbor's dream, which I think is a interesting, pushes in the direction that it's not about the individual in distress in these cases. So we may begin asking, is the wish to procreate truly the living will of the deceased? Might it not be better understood as the will of the remaining spouse and parents masquerading as the will of the dead, as some critics have readily suggested? Or, and this is the point, or should we remain open to the possibility that it is not the will of the living at all, and for that matter not at all a willing, but rather a calling from the dead? And consequently, we may ask, what role does a sense of loss play in the tragedy of the childless dead? Is it merely an emotional breakdown awaiting catharsis, or is loss, in this originary sense, not a psychological modality, but rather a state of affairs that binds together the living and the dead, and persists until the mourners fulfill their duty towards the deceased, helping to heal the broken cycle of life and death? So, from this, I move to a discussion of the anthropology of the problem of postmortem sperm retrieval, and look at some of the writings. I know this is pretty basic for anthropologists, but look back at the work of Freuds, who actually studied some of these questions. And for Freuds, the important insight, at least for my purposes, is the idea that death is not just merely a bodily event, but it's a social event. It has to do with the disintegration of society, and the practices and rituals surrounding the mourning period actually talk about this. The idea is that on the one hand, the soul continues to hover over the body, hence the idea of a first burial and then a second burial. And in between the first burial and the second burial, there's this liminal moment where the family of the deceased, the mourners, are also excluded from or are in the fringes or in the margins of society and have a special status until reintegration, social reintegration, is achieved and the soul departs completely from the body. So I think I want to summarize at least up to this point the main argument. That is that in all three languages, the law, psychology, and anthropology, what we see are different understanding of what exactly is lost and what is preserved. And I think it's interesting that in law, there's a notion that the will of the deceased continues after death. You'd expect it perhaps to die. No, but the law allows it to continue. It's preserved by the law after the loss of the person. And in psychology, there's this notion of mourning, which actually allows to let go, whereas melancholy holds on to something and doesn't let go. And this is a preservation that is seen as pathological. And here with the anthropologist, again, we see different ways of thinking about this dynamics of loss and preservation. Here in the language of anthropology, disintegration and reintegration and the hovering of the soul over the body. The last part of the paper is an attempt to say more than what anthropology can tell us by a historical comparison, which I would have thought was a bit outlandish, except that it appears everywhere in the discussion, including in the legal discussions of this. So this is not something I'm imposing. A comparison between postmortem sperm retrieval and the levirate marriage is not something that I'm imposing on this, but rather something that comes out from the legal and ethical discussions of this. And the levirate marriage, as you all know, is a biblical duty, obligation for the brother of the deceased to marry and bring children with with the widow, in the case in which the brother died childless. And so this is an obligation to make a name for the deceased, with a specific reference to this idea of a continuation of the lineage of zera, and not in the biological sense of sperm, but in a more genealogical sense. And so what I end up asking in the paper, I begin to suggest a comparison of what exactly. So on the one hand, there seems to be similar practices, that the idea that death is not the final word, that there needs to be life after death, that there needs to be a continuity, seems to be something that these two practices share. But then my question is, what are the differences, and are the differences telling? And what can they tell us about our understanding of this continuation, of this preservation after loss? And I point to three things, and actually I'd like to put a question mark and open this for discussion. But what I say in the paper is that there's a clear movement from the liberal notion of a right to clearly a duty. I mean, the levirate marriage is a duty, and it's not something that is optional. And so I think this echoes actually the way also postmortem sperm retrieval is practiced. although it is said legally to be a right, I think in many ways it is perceived to be a duty that the family or the grandparents somehow feel towards the deceased, or the community, the neighbor feels committed to. And two other aspects of this have to do with the notion of how the name, so to speak, the soul, that which remains, is now not something very spiritual, but rather the biology, right? So the genetic lineage now becomes more important than some more open-ended notion of the name, genealogical notion. And then that's something, so the soul transforms in this way, and the body transforms. The body, which was in many ways not important in the Levirate marriage, the body was what was set aside, now becomes this reservoir of genetic material, and now it can be extracted out of the body. The lineage can be actually extracted out of the body. So the soul, which was a spiritual, becomes in some ways material. The body, which was material, now becomes abstracted and extracted in this way. I'm not sure that this opposition exactly works, but I'm actually interested in hearing how you think this can be conceptualized. So thank you.
I was told that the morning sessions were fascinating, and apologize for being absent. And I can't excuse myself if a funeral or IVF. The reason being that I got up in the morning with a very heavy feeling, probably following a dream, that my comment didn't do justice to my thoughts on Shai's paper. So I decided to rewrite them. Now I feel that justice is being done. So let me state at the outset that to my mind, Shai's paper offers a novel, if not groundbreaking, approach to the meaning of the nexus of temporality, kinship, and technology in contemporary culture. Furthermore, his analysis of the epistemological repercussions of PMSR taps an intriguing moment in the interpretation of modes of representation, that is, a move from metaphorical articulation for experience to ontologically imbued expression of reality. This certainly calls for elaboration and qualification. On the face of it, the paper juggles between two explanatory options. The first is a conservative perspective that holds that there is no real novelty in assuring paternal progeny through institutionalized forms of surrogacy, such as Levirate law, or like in its Sudanese equivalent of ghost marriages among the Dinka, or elsewhere by proxy matrimony. Sperm in these instances serves as a corporeal turned metaphoric vehicle for preserving a smooth and guarded descent within a given lineage, a biological signifier of a social signified. Accordingly, kinship is understood as a socially sustained structure symbolized by genetic matter, which could be figuratively transmuted or exchanged from one male to another. In other words, it is the idea of ancestral sperm or blood that accounts for charting a familial male succession of fraternity. A telling example for this kind of transformation from the biological to the metaphorical is evinced in the sublimation of the term blood brothers from a marker of a common genetic origin to the idiomatic usage of blood brothers as a trope for comradeship forged on the battlefield. Where metaphor reigns, particularly in the language of kinship, as Claude Lévi-Strauss taught us, no limits are set for ever-increasing circles of relations and relationships. Thus, the anthropological literature on kinship formations is rife with cases of putative, fictive genealogies devised and designed by force of circumstance rather than by the power of consanguinity. Blood is no thicker than water, as observed by anthropologist Godfrey Leonhardt, and I would echo it by suggesting that water is no thicker than sperm. The emblematic state of sperm, therefore, rather than its inborn properties, is the procreator of kinship systems, which in turn become models for and of imagined collectivities such as clans, ethnic groups, or national communities. In this respect, cutting-edge technologies of harvesting, freezing, and reproducing sperm do not break loose from well-tried and trite traditional norms and customs that socially contrive the familial under the guise of the natural. Rather, the new know-how is a scientifically endorsed incarnation of old myths. The second position, gingerly and critically entertained in the paper, is diametrically opposed to the first, as it parts with metaphor and resorts to the literal, the material, the ontological, the physical, and not surprisingly, eventually flirts with the metaphysical. Sorry for that, Shai. These diverse conceptual domains are strung together by one common negative theme. They are all divested of any representational merit, divorced from language games, and in a non-symbolic manner present the thing in itself. Subsequently, a new and challenging notion of kinship emerges, one that revolutionizes our view of the regulation and composition of descent lines. It spells an undying, unbending bonding cemented and solidified by bone-type objects such as the perennial sperm, rather than by the decaying ephemerality of rotting flesh. Open-ended metaphoric imagination, therefore, is replaced by a self-contained metonymical closed system based on monistic rather than dualistic assumptions. The insinuation of incest ingrained in the wish of parents to insist of securing endogenous procreation is hence no coincidence in this technologically induced reformatting of the family form. As this nascent type of blunt bond in keen interconnectivity identifies matter with soul, prioritizes cyclical time over linear duration, and anchors personhood in heredity. No social structuring of kinship ties is summoned or needed, nor is any set of duties and obligations. Sorry. Nor are any sets of duties or obligations negotiated. Instead, lives are interlocked, preserved, and unrelentingly continued through the invisible transmission capabilities of the genome innate in the visible and malleable body fluid of the sperm. Thus, progeny is no longer deemed as being conveyed by meaning coached in humanly engineered culture, but the very essence of organic vitality common to all living creatures. This is presumably the nearest stance to some schools of biosociology that look for the antecedents of culture in the interplay of the determinacy of genes, the haphazard effect of mutations, and the indeterminacy of the environment. The image of the body evolving from this outlook is of sheer corporeality, a mere fleshless bag of bones. It is self-evident that such bodies are symbolically skinless, and as such, their emergent presence in the discourse of kinship pulls the rug from underneath the feet of the long-standing and well-established socio-anthropological language, a nomenclature that suffices the body natural with the body social through a metaphoric terminology of embodied selfhood, culture, society, politics, otherness, distinctions, texts, and styles, all supposedly nature-culture hybrids. Having shunned away from all this, Shai's proposed construal of the practice of PMSR forebodes the incipient reversal to ontological materialism in social anthropology, a current trend triggered by the growing disenchantment with over-constructionism and postmodern wild goose chases. The other part of Shai's reading of parental passion for sperm-based dynasty is, however, no less thought-provoking. That is, the metaphysical argument that there exists a strive, not to say an imperative, among bereaved parents for turning transitional mourning into the everlasting, transcendental, natural, repetitive cycle of time and death, of life and death. A cosmic eternal return, to use Mircea Eliade's locution, to the mythically atavistic order of life reflected in the natural pulse of time. As Roland Barthes propounded, the mythical is often masked as the natural, and in this sense, the move towards stark facticity could be seen as a shift in the direction of the fictional, thus confounding the physical with the metaphysical. In a way, symbolic immortality, a culturally fabricated death denial strategy, is substituted by the brow-raising practice of physical immortality, which in the Israeli case, unfolded in this paper, is reclaimed in the name of the body politic haloed by the collective ethos of visceral sacrifice at the altar of the nation. Israeli cosmology, therefore, commensurate with the temporal circularity of life, and both corporeal and metaphorical burial of the respective body physical and the body politic are patently denied for the sake of one indissoluble funerary rite that unifies the two. This is also the juncture where the somatic meets the cultural, to the point of indivisibility that subsequently forestalls any possibility of one representing the other. Moreover, here Shai's trinity of soul, corpse, and mourners merges its seemingly separate modules into one powerful unit of transcultural posterity disengaged from the vernacular, but firmly engaged into the universal. This uncanny connection that transcends the exclusive in favor of the inclusive obviates, in effect, the omnipresence and omnipotence of metaphor, thus taking issue inadvertently but constructively with the long and staunch legacy of the philosophy and anthropology of mimesis and representation. From Plato's cave to Cassirer's symbolic animals, Said's imagery of Orientalism, Langer's infallible symbolism, and Lakoff and Johnson's metaphors we live by, to mention but a few, experience has been thought to be mediated, communicated, molded, and channelized through culturally propelled images. What Shai seems to suggest is that metaphors we live by do not necessarily turn into metaphors we die by. Rather, it is the ontological swing that sets the scene for facing the death of a loved one, or perhaps in the face of death in general, it also applies to one's own terminality. In support of the paper's second position, I would like to adduce some findings elicited from my own study of the elderly. To give short shrift to ethnographic substance, it is transpired that the older and frailer old people grow, the more prone they would be to eschew the metaphorical and to express themselves via literal metaphysical lingo of the here and now of survival alongside an adherence to an ahistorical sense of temporality. Could it be the case then that those bereaved parents cited in the paper plead for PMSR in a momentary impulse of premature onset of old age? Following that, another broader question could be broached. Does the submersion into a state of grief-driven melancholy that urges PMSR seeking herald an induction into a different human condition where time stands still and loss is preserved paradoxically through resurrection? Sperm is likened to bones, and dry bones, as we are told, could come apocalyptically alive.
Thank you.
It's not a paper.
No. This is very interesting. Thank you, Haim. It was beautiful. So I don't want to treat it as an argument and argue with it, but for the sake of discussion, I'd like to resist your interpretation of the paper. I think that it's in the paper. And so I guess what I'm trying to do now is clarify, or actually say maybe a little bit more. So you're right. There is this movement in the paper, except that I'm not sure that it is from the cultural to the natural from the metaphoric to the metonymic, from the language to the flesh and bones, because, and just to put it again very, very shortly, because the dead body in this case is not sheer corporeality. It's not that. The sheer corporeality, if I don't know how to make if there exists such a thing, and I accept that under certain circumstances there could be sheer corporeality.
Ideal types.
Yes, but in this case it's not sheer. There's a lot of work done in order to turn this body to what it is, and this is all. So there's nothing sheer about this. First of all, there's all the technology that needs to be brought into the picture in order to make this dead body alive. And part of it is pretty intrusive. A lot of it is very complicated. And so the question, and this is actually what I think I was hinting at when I was talking about how there is this spiritualization of the body, not spiritualization in the old sense, but that the techniques that are put into the body are to turn it into an energy resource. That is, that even after death, there's no real death, because the body continues to be a source of life. And for this to happen, a lot of work needs to be done. So I think that if there is sheer corporeality, I don't know where I would find it, but definitely not in this particular body. So I think that what seems to be simply natural flesh and bones actually has a whole metaphysics of its own, and is nothing natural about it. And I think that's precisely what is so striking about this practice, to the extent that
the blurred line, a very fine line between the physical and the metaphysical.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly what you're describing now. It's not just sheer corporeality.
Yeah.
Is some kind of a cosmic idea of the place of the corpse.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess that should do for now.
Yeah, thank you, Shai. This was both very interesting and troubling, content-wise,
right.
Paper-wise. One of the things that it relates to that I found troubling, or two aspects, is it seems that this sort of extension of the idea of reproductive autonomy and the concept of parenting behind it puts biological parenting at the forefront. And this seems to me like the other side of the coin of the idea, for example, that children of sperm donors have a right to know the identity of the sperm donor, because in some sense they have a right to a heritage that somehow isn't there, even if they have actual parents, caretakers, and live in a otherwise functioning and or good enough family. And another aspect of this, and this Rachel in your quote says, "I want a little kivan," and this also relates. I think Sandel, when he talks about designer babies, says one of the problems is that the idea of parenting involves something of accepting the given, that you don't know, that there is something that is sort of, even by design, something is thrown at you, and you're not in complete control of what it is and what it will be like and who it is and what its genetic characteristics here. And here we find as socially acceptable a whole project of sort of not only ancestral but also of really sort of cloning. I mean, there's a function, there's a place in this family that little Kivan is going to have to, or Osler is going to have to occupy. And this seems to me bordering on the grotesque. I mean, in fact, I think that somehow this whole project is viewed sympathetically and here, you know, and so that seems to me very troubling. Not because our sympathies are not, our hearts, you know, it's obvious that the story of the mother is heartbreaking completely, but I'm not sure that the project is one worth pursuing when it's described in these terms.
Okay, so first of all, I was also thinking whether this is another case of biological parenting, and I'm not, I mean, the emphasis on the biological in parenting, and I'm not quite sure that this is the story. First of all, there are no biological parents in this story. I mean, think of the, right, so the the father is dead. The mother doesn't want to bring a child with the sperm of the dead partner. So we are now looking for a surrogate, right? I mean, it's not important that it's her ova at all. I mean, what's important is that it's not parenting. What's important here is that it's the continuation of the sperm of the dead, and now anyone, in principle, could be the carrier of this sperm, and nothing in this practice actually calls for the parents to be biological. The real parent in this story is dead, and then the question is what will take place with the sperm. So I really think that, and this ties up to a more general thought that I have, and this has also been in the Israeli courts recently, of the entrepreneur parent, the parent who takes the sperm from one donor, the ova from another, and a surrogate from the third. Now this is part of the story, right? This is part of the story. It's not it's anything but biological parenting, because the person who will be.
What is this entrepreneur parent?
Well, just the one that so Israeli law, and in many countries this is also the case, that at least one of the parents needs to have a biological connection with the offspring. So you can take an ova donation, or you can have sperm donation, or you can have a surrogate, but you cannot have all three. Because if you have all three, the child will have no biological relationship to any of the parents. But so it's true that at the moment Israeli law prohibits it. In the US it's possible. But I think that if we look at it conceptually, this is where this is going. I mean, there's nothing that requires actually biological parenting. It's this planned parenting that is using biological materials as it wishes, but it's not exactly an obsession with biological parenting. There seems to be, in this case at least, some kind of fixation on the biology of the dead, but not of the parent, not of the parent that's raising the child. This is my take on it. Grotesque? Okay. Between us? Yes, I think so. But the point was to take a step away from that and actually ask whatever reaction this raises in us, the question is what exactly is the problem? What is new? What is so surprising in this combination?
As I told you, Shai, I liked the paper very much, and I was mostly convinced. And I think one way to respond to Haim's reservation is to say that, well, the body becomes sheer corporeality after 36 hours.
Yes.
In your particular case, I mean, there is a moment at which, and you are interested in the just in the interval between legal death and the threshold of becoming sheer corporeality, in which the sperm can be retrieved. You didn't mention in your oral presentation something which I was struck by, and that was you described it as a kind of violent break in the cycle of life and death, which is involved in those cases of young people dying in war or in accidents. So this kind of break may justify what could be called emergency steps, like sperm retrieval, which are not natural and involve a kind of violence in themselves. I mean, because the invasiveness of the procedure is definitely has an element of violence in it. But what I wanted to add is that beyond the idea of a seed, to put it, it's a complementary explanation of the practice in more modern terms, let's say existentialist terms. What happens with violent premature death is a sense not only of loss, but also of waste. I mean, when people die at the ripe age, we feel the loss, but not the waste. Now here there's a sense of waste, and the only way we can counter this sense of waste is to retroactively give meaning to that life which was lost but not completely wasted. And that is by having descendants. In a parallel way to which many of us see procreation as the only real source in a godless world, let's say, the only real source of meaning to our temporary existence in this world. So that sense of continuity. So in this case, we do it in place of the lost child. I mean, we do it for his or her sake.
Yeah. So this is very interesting. I need to think about it more. But one question I have as a follow-up is, where did this notion of waste come from? I mean, why waste?
Too young.
So tragedy, but waste is very strong. You know, waste already brings with it a lot of baggage on potentialities and control over resources, right? So there's a resource here. So the person is a resource. The body is a resource, and there's a wasted potentiality that was not brought to fruition. There's now the frozen sperm, which the parents say to the spouse, the widow, "What? Now you want to throw it away? What a waste!" No, I know. But I think that this is part of an ecology of waste and resources and the potentiality of resources, which I think that is built into some of this. Now I know you weren't going in that direction for the. You're talking about the life, not the sperm. I know, I understand, but I wonder where this comes from. Yeah, fine. Yeah.
I just, in response to David's question, which I also find very interesting, I think that the sense of waste comes from another place completely. It is from how we see death. I mean, death, to lose Philippe Arias, of course, death is not walking alongside us. Death is ahead of us. And when death is ahead of us, the life trajectory projects a different image completely. And it's an image of something that could be complete or not complete.
Right. It's very linear.
Yeah, right.
Non-Buddhist, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure my question's really formulated well, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I guess one thing that I noticed, and maybe this was explicit in the paper, was a strange. One of the reasons I think this is a complex case is because of a strange intersection of liberal and illiberal ideas. On one hand, a liberal sense of personal autonomy that somehow gets entrained into a very illiberal idea of family continuity, right? And that seems to me to be the source of a lot of the discomfort that emerges from the case. The question I wanted to ask you was, if it was a kind of generalization question. I was thinking about Tamar's 2,000-year-old date poem, and I was thinking about the resurrection of extinct species. And I wonder if you think that there is something general that could be said about the way that these kinds of biotechnologies are changing our understanding of the linearity of genealogy or of the timeliness of reproduction. Because it seems to me in the case that you presented here, you have worked really hard and really effectively to root this in a very, very particular cultural context. And almost as if to say, don't try to generalize this from the technology itself, because it's never going to work, because you can't understand this in these early contexts without putting it in the context of levirate marriage. So, I don't know, would you be willing to take that step, to make a broader generalization?
Even to non-humans, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, for the first part of your question, the contradiction or the tension between the liberal and the illiberal, I usually don't say this. I mean, I usually don't think this way, that the liberal is a sham. I mean, that the liberal way of putting it is a sham. But in these cases, I actually do think that that from the beginning, the liberal aspect of this, or the way it's framed as a question of autonomy and reproductive autonomy, is very on the surface. I mean, it doesn't really go very very deep. I at least not in the Israeli cases, but there is a sense, not in the liberal sense, but there is a sense of some kind of will, a very strong will. Not the will, I don't think, of the deceased, but a very strong will to keep this going. Sometimes I think about it as the will of the sperm. Somehow, like the sperm, like the real agent here is the sperm wants to live.
Sperm never dies.
The
right?
sperm
never dies.
Well, the sperm never
also
dies. I don't know. It's
keep-
frozen. What do you mean? Well, in that
also,
sense.
it's just the will of the sperm is also very much in the discourse of, the sperm meets the egg. Who meets the egg? The one that wants it more, is fastest, and, has motivation.
Yeah. As for whether this could be applicable beyond the Israeli case, beyond the specific case, from beyond humans to non-humans, I think that's, for me, this is exactly part of the question for the conference, and and I wish. So what I don't discuss in the paper enough, I think, is temporality, is the way. So I talk about the cycle of life, but I don't talk enough, and I think I should talk more about what happens to time in this process, and the freezer, which again comes up in some of the freezer here is and I think is very important because it's a temporal thing. It freezes time also in this. If the freezer is unless there's a meltdown.
Yeah, so this is in a way my question ties together some of the conversation about waste and Etienne's point, because I was thinking about the freezer, thinking about it as when you think about waste, one way to think thermodynamically, right? Then is waste. If you look back to the 19th century in the history of thermodynamics, that what were people really concerned about when they were designing their steam engines, like waste and inefficiency, right? What was going to be lost in the frictions, right, that cause that waste. So that's a way to relocate where we think about waste. And what's beautiful about thermodynamics is the way that it brings, temperature and time together. And you have this line about the soul is biological, where the physical corpse is spiritualized. The distinctly modern sense of the material world is seen as a source of energy that can be exploited for human ends. So I think that's a starting point for thinking about temporality and time in what the freezer is doing. And I was very taken by the analogies to bone, right? That the freezer turns something corporeal turns flesh into bone, and that made me start thinking about work that's been done on the circulation. So this is a way of taking it to other kinds of cases of repatriation in the realm of bones of Native Americans and things like that. So NAGPRA, which is about returning materials that have wound up being untimely or out of place. And then I started thinking, rematriation, and so maybe there's something there. But what I was thinking of I couldn't quite wrap my head around the soul is biological, whereas the spiritual course is spiritualized. And at first I thought, is it sheer corporeality? But then I thought, well, maybe the language of sacralization is what's here. There's something about the sacred, and that relates to what can be killed and what can't be killed. And what's interesting in some conversations I've had with people that work in the politics of repatriation is that there's inevitably this tension where the scientist, let's say, or the paleontologist or the anthropologist says, you want your bones back because they're spiritual and special to you, and then the Native American says, no, you're the ones that made them sacred. You're the ones. So this sort of phantomatic dimensions of the sacred might be an interesting space to think. So I'm going to just stop because there's so many things to say, but it's
more.
Yeah, I just had a related kind of question about the use of the Hertz story and the bone. And so you say at one point, the sperm of the deceased is a bone-type object. Par excellence, it is what is left of the body and continues to bond together the deceased in their liminal condition. And so with the Hertz story, it's once the body decomposes, which is going to be a 3-month to 6-month process, we know we're ready to bury the bones and leave the dead in the community of ancestors. We can move on. But that's where the sperm is not like the bone, because the story doesn't end there. We can't bury the sperm. It's suspended in this frozen state. And so the question, I guess, is what happens to the temporality of mourning? And Rachel seems to provoke this questioning. She keeps on asking. And so as long as you can keep the sperm alive, you can't move into a Hertzian process of collective mourning.
So, I think one of the interesting findings in this is that most of the sperm that is retrieved post-mortem and frozen is never used. So this is actually, I think, similar to
the purposes that it's intended.
even so the case of the widow in contesting the grandparents, or the grandparents contesting the widow, is actually exceptional. But there is a normal part of this. The part where she decides, to freeze the sperm, that's the part where it's kind of benign, because there is this, I think, Hertzian moment where it's, okay, we're going to freeze it. The law doesn't allow to use it for 6 months. That's the decomposing of the body, but also of the mourning process and the memory, processing the memory of the deceased. And after 6 months, you can use it, but there's no plan really in most of the cases to actually use this, and it's just left there to be forgotten. Now, it's true, and this is the other part of what you're saying, is, okay, it's left to be forgotten, but then somebody can be reminded, or not let go of this, and this is something that is distinct to the freezer in comparison to the body. So I think that's helpful to think more on that.
How long do we have?
All in all, it's an hour. So if we started, I think we're pretty much. One more question down there.
Yeah, I was thinking, reading the paper about François Héritier and analysis of incest that was also mentioned. And I guess the trouble reading the paper comes from the feeling of incest, but not in a classical idea of incest, but more of an incestuous relation between the mother of the child and the widow through the sperm. And I guess from the material in the paper, we think of this relation between the mother and the widow, but that it's a question between women. But maybe to avoid the idea of biological identity that would be prohibited, it would be interesting to know about the distances between the mother and the surrogate mother that could be found. And otherwise, it seems that the idea of a too promiscuous relation between the mother and the widow is what precisely raises the problem.
So this is very, very interesting. So first of all, how important are the grandparents in this story? I also want to ask that. It seems, and this is actually where law becomes helpful, under the law, the grandparents have no standing. The surrogate, this stranger, has standing, because the surrogate under Israeli law, but the argument of the surrogate is that she has the right to be a mother, the right to parent. There's no recognized right to be a grandparent under Israeli law, but there is a developing right to be a parent. And so this actually planned mother, but surrogate for the grandparents, is standing before the court and saying, here's an available sperm, I want it. And so I think you're right that the grandparents are playing a very important role here, sociologically, culturally, but I think that it's also important to go back to the sperm, where it seems to me that that's where a lot of the action is. And as for the mother and the widow, well, Joanna and I had a funny conversation about this over dinner, that we were saying, is this the ideal situation in which the mother-in-law can actually choose her daughter-in-law for her perfect son, right? Because now that he's dead, he's beyond perfection, right? I mean,
but it's never personal; it's always structural.
So, anyway, more food for thought.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.